Welcome, everybody. I'll do a couple of minutes of intro while our members are still joining us. I am so very excited to hear Professor Abrajano for this presentation. You know, it's always difficult when we set our programs a year ahead. So we started looking at who we wanted to reach out to, what topics we wanted to have presentations on. And we looked in our crystal ball and said, oh, well, with the election coming up in November, can't think of anybody better than Professor Abrajano to share her reflections. And wow, were we right on the money with that one. So we have two really spectacular presentations lined up for you today, one right after the other. We hope that you will relax in a comfortable chair and stick with us for both presentations. The first one, of course, is with Professor Abrajano on the role of race in the 2020 presidential election. And then the second one with the curator of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, who will be speaking to us. I'm really excited about both of these presentations. Today and now we would like to welcome Professor Marissa Abrajano. She is Professor of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. Her research interests focus on racial ethnic inequalities in the political system, particularly with political participation, voting and campaigns, and the mass media. She has written widely. She's the author of several award-winning books, such as White Backlash, Immigration, Race, and American Politics, and Campaigning to the New American Electorate, Television Advertising to Latinos. Earlier this year, Professor Abrajano was appointed provost of Earl Warren College. Let's all warmly welcome now Professor and Provost Marissa Abrajano.
Thank you, Susan, for the kind introduction, and hi to everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm glad that my presentation today is timely and important, and I know you have a packed agenda, so I will start my presentation without further ado. So I'm going to talk about this work that I've been doing. Well, this was a book, as Susan mentioned, called White Backlash. Can everybody see the slides? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, perfect. So this is based on that book, but also within the context of the most recent presidential elections. And I have to say, we started writing this book. So this book is a collaboration with one of my, another fellow colleague of mine, with Professor Heinal, who's at GPS. And when we started working in this book back in, 2012, 2013, as you'll see, and it came out in 2015, we certainly didn't expect that so much of what we had written about would continue to lay to bear to be true in the 2016 presidential election and in our most recent one. And so I'm honored to be able to share some of these thoughts and research with you today. So the basic premise of this book is the reality that our country has experienced significant demographic change in the last 65 years. Currently, as of 2020, our nation is now 13.7% comprised of a foreign-born population. And immigration has always been a central part of the experience in the United States. And now more than ever, we've seen immigration transforming us in two important ways. First is the growing share of the foreign-born population, but also at the same time, because of where our immigrants are coming from, we're also experiencing significant racial change in the composition of the American electorate. So Latino and Asian American populations have grown at rapid rates. Latinos now have replaced Black Americans as the largest racial minority in the United States. and whites are projected to lose majority status by 2050. So over time, the proportion of white Americans has fallen from roughly 90% of the population 40 years ago to currently roughly about 65% of the US population. So what does this demographic transformation mean? So as we pay attention to the news and read from both the media as well as in scholarly research, this transformation has the potential to raise both hopes and fears. Of course, we know that immigrants fill a vital economic role, help to enrich the culture that we have in the United States as a nation of immigrants. It has led to greater acceptance of diversity. And so those are some of the hopes that immigration can bring about. But at the same time, we also know that this transformation has also raised significant fears about jobs, our social safety net, the culture of what it means to be American. And so it also, as we've seen historically as well, very much can lead to heightened racial and ethnic tensions and what we refer to in this project as a backlash. Okay. So the main question that we raised in this book was, we asked, well, how is the transformation affecting American politics? Okay. So if our intuition is correct that immigration and racial change can raise fears about jobs, welfare, and culture, if immigration and race are being infused into debates about policy and parties, does that mean then that the changing population is causing a broad conservative backlash among white Americans? And that's really the premise of our book. And so the main question that stems out of this project is, to what extent is the issue of immigration and immigration itself affecting the core political decisions of white Americans? And we explore this question in 3 different ways. We look at party identification, so whether or not somebody chooses to identify with a party. We look at vote choice, so meaning who do they vote for, both in presidential and congressional elections. And then what kinds of policy preferences and positions are white Americans adopting? And is that in any way shaped by their positions on immigration? Okay. So, of course, there are 2 sides to this story. You can easily imagine why immigration might have no effect at all or impact on these core political decisions that we as political scientists have studied for decades and decades. Okay. So one counter argument could be that, well, many immigrants have assimilated into US society, right? Many are 4th or 5th generation immigrants, and therefore the salience of immigration in the US should be on the decline. There is also some data to support, if again, looking over this longitudinally, that racial tolerance amongst white Americans has increased. Another argument would be that other events and issues are more important than immigration, right? Like the economy, for example, or abortion, which has always been linked to, say, your partisan preferences. And also, if you just look at the existing research, we don't have any evidence to suggest that immigration affects partisan politics among white Americans. And then historically, at least in my discipline, many of the past major studies on what shapes vote choice either ignore race and immigration or focus, have primarily focused on the Black-white divide, okay? And then primarily, previous research on immigration has really focused more on the causes of immigration views and ignores broader consequences of immigration. So taken all together, we make this argument, and our theory essentially is that immigration is something that is too big to miss in the United States. Right? If we just even think about the fact that immigrants and their children are 1/4 of the population and only projected to grow over time, that's one aspect to it. If you also think about the role that immigration and race have played in the current political climate, I think that's not a hard sell to suggest that they have played prominent roles, not only in this most recent presidential election, but dating back to 2016 and even to previous elections before that, okay? And then the other, oops, sorry. And then the other piece of the argument is that there is this prevalent threat narrative that dominates much of the rhetoric that we see from certain political elites, as well as by the mass media. And so what we see primarily are these framings and this narrative that emphasize the loss of jobs, declining wages, fiscal costs associated with the rise in immigration, crime, and cultural decline. Now, I should also say that this prevalent threat narrative primarily has focused on undocumented immigration in the United States, but there's also been some studies to suggest that when Americans think about immigration, there is oftentimes equating immigration itself to undocumented immigration. And a lot of that is just because of how it's framed in the mass media especially, but also by political elites. Okay. So irrespective of the actual cost and counter arguments and what the real information tells us, okay, if we actually focus on public opinion, especially on white Americans, there seems to be evidence to suggest that they do buy into this threat narrative. So for example, 70% of white Americans feel that immigrants are a burden. 62% think that they add to the crime problem. 59% of white Americans think that immigrants take away jobs from Americans. And then in a most recent survey that I did last year that focused on information, that survey actually found too that a strong majority of white Americans actually overestimate the size of the undocumented immigration population, right? So much higher than what in actuality it is. So we also know that immigration is increasingly being tied to partisan politics, okay? This has not traditionally been the case. If you remember, the last, I would say, or the only regularization program we've ever had of undocumented immigrants, which was with IRCA back in the 1980s, that was actually passed under the Reagan administration, where we had amnesty given to undocumented immigrants. But today, in our polarized political climate, immigration is very much tied into partisan politics and has become highly polarized as well, and has been divided on the issue of immigration, okay? Republican elites have clearly taken the position of adopting an anti-immigrant stance, while Democratic elites have either taken a pro or more progressive stance on immigration or an agnostic approach on immigration, right? So these are just images, if you recall, of former President Trump visiting the border. And then of course, this was the immigration policies after the Department of Homeland Security in detention centers after the separation of families, if you recall, several years ago, right? So that's just kind of a brief nutshell of, you know, where we've been in the last couple of years. So what is our logic, as just a brief recap? Okay, so our argument is that number one, white Americans see that the US is changing primarily in this demographic way. Many believe that immigration is driving negative changes to a whole host of policies and public public policies in the United States, coupled with the fact that the Republican Party offers much stronger opposition to immigration. And so for many, we argue, this is a powerful motivation to defect to the Republican Party, okay? Now, to be fair, we also look back historically and acknowledge that this is not something that is unique to our current period in time. We have seen this pattern before in our history. White defection from the Democratic Party in response to the Democratic Party's support of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And of course, if you think back and going to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1900s, widespread immigration backlash has always been a consistent story in different periods of American history, right? So this is, part of a larger theme that we've witnessed in our country over our history. So to test this theory and argument, we use a wide range of survey data on both public opinion, as well as survey data that taps into white Americans' political preferences and attitudes. And then along with that analysis, we also look at the way the media covers immigration. Okay, so we focus on a whole host of different media outlets, newspaper coverage, to see how they talk about immigration, whether indeed you do start to see these specific frames that they use more so than others. So that's essentially kind of the research design that we use to answer this question. And I just want to briefly present to you today some of the findings from that analysis. Okay, so here is just a snapshot of a bivariate relationship. So just looking at the relationship between your position on immigration, what your view is on immigration, and the question here particularly is, what is your view of undocumented immigrants? So here on the x-axis, you can see that it ranges from 1 going from more negative views to 6 going to more positive views. And then on the y-axis, this is just the percentage of individuals who identify as Democratic. Okay, and so if you take this top left figure first, you can see that the relationship is you see an upward trend, such that more positive views of undocumented immigrants is associated with a higher percentage of those identifying as Democrats. Okay. On the flip side, you find that more negative views of undocumented immigrants is associated with a higher percentage of those who self-identify as Republicans, as well as supporting and as well as voting for them, right? So notice that this first column here, this is the percent Democrat identifiers, Republican identifiers, sorry, the first row, I should say. And then the second row is those who, it's actually the percentage who vote for either a Republican president or for Congress, okay? So even when we take into account other factors that have been found to influence partisanship, such as demographics, your socioeconomic status, your religious preferences, we still find this strong relationship to persist. We also find that white partisanship over time has shifted its support to the Republican Party. Okay, so what is the bigger picture here, right? If it is indeed the case that immigration is pushing white Americans to the right, we should see steady growth in white republicanism over time. And so here in this next graph, this snapshot, we're going back from 1952 all the way up to, I think, 2008 here, is that we have seen, if you look at this blue line here, that's the percent of Democrats, of whites who identify as Democrats. And then the red line here is the percent who identifies Republicans, okay? So you see percent Democrat decreasing over time, percent Republican increasing over time, okay? And this is just partisanship. Now, if you look at how they actually vote, you can also see a similar trend happening. There's increasing white support for congressional Republicans over time as well, right? So in the late 1980s, early 1990s, white support for congressional Republicans is about 50-50. By the time you get into 2014, that jump has gone up by 10%, right? And then if you, just to look at the most recent time period, this is what turnout looked like in the most recent 2 presidential elections, okay? In both the 2016 and then 2020 presidential elections, white support for the Democratic presidential candidate, Clinton in 2016, and Biden in 2020 was 37% and 41% respectively. So the majority of white voters in both of these presidential election years supported the Republican candidate, okay? Whereas, as you can see here, just as a comparative static, that for Black Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, the overwhelming majority, I'm sorry, this number for Biden should be 65, not 34, 34, overwhelmingly support the Democratic candidate. Okay, so just looking at national trends during presidential election years, you certainly see this racial divide in their support for presidential candidates along the lines of race and partisanship. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, we also did a host of additional analyses. We found that the media coverage of immigration is correlated with white partisanship. So what that means is that media coverage of immigration, like I said, which is largely negative, moves whites into supporting, to self-identifying as was part of the Republican Party. We also did additional analysis where we looked at the size of the state immigrant population and to what extent that affects white partisanship and policy preferences, okay? So what I mean by that is if you think about a state like California, all right, the question becomes, are states that have large immigrant populations, does that also influence your partisanship and your policy preferences amongst white Americans, okay? And the analysis here found that, so in a state like California, for example, where roughly 40% of the population are a Latino, that tends to be, so the higher your share is of an immigrant population, that tends to be correlated with the implementation of more punitive policies. And the kinds of policies that we were looking at was related to crime, to welfare. But what we also found is that after a certain threshold of the population size, so again, think about California, once the Latino population is actually large enough, this policy shifts back to the left. Okay. So again, just to reiterate here, the overall pattern that we found in our research is that white Americans with more negative views of immigrants are more likely to identify as Republican, vote Republican, and favor punitive public policies. Okay. And as the impact of immigration expands, white Americans are shifting to the Republican Party. And we saw evidence of that not only in their partisan preferences, but if you actually look at how does that translate into their voting preferences, if you look at the results from the 2016 and 2020 election, you can see that that's pretty obvious as well. So I wanted to end the presentation by talking about some of the implications of our research, okay? One is that immigration, we argue, and I hope I convinced you, is that immigration is very much now at the core of American politics. I think it would be difficult to say, particularly in our current political climate, that immigration and race are strongly infused in our conversations about politics today, and that we can't talk about American politics without talking about how immigration is factored into there and also about race, okay? I think one of the contributions we hope to show in this research as well is that the racial divisions in this country and the nuances have become increasingly complex over the last 40 years, largely because of the immigrant population coming from a vast array of different countries, but primarily dominated by immigrants coming from Latin America, but also from Asia. And so that makes the kind of traditional black-white divide that can characterize the American population at the turn of the century a bit more complex today. And so thinking about the racial hierarchy and where immigrants fit into that system has become not as obvious. Okay, but I think one of the realities is that there is this widespread growing white backlash, and scholars, and this backlash is leading to increasingly larger racial divides in American politics. And again, if we only have to look back in what happened in the summer of last year in 2020 with the racial unrest, I think that statement more than ever holds true. Okay, thinking about especially like how this backlash has actually translated, not just within the public, but also with the rise of white nationalists in the country and that white nationalist movement. So this white backlash that we sort of started exploring in kind of the couple of years ago, this has actually evolved very quickly into a more organized and I don't know if I would characterize it as a grassroots movement, but certainly much more organized than just what we were observing in this analysis from public opinion, right? There was actually a movement happening currently that is at the forefront of this wide backlash, right? And I think one of the questions that we often get from this research is, well, you paint this the findings don't paint a very optimistic picture of the future of American politics, right? And I think one point worth discussing is whether or not this backlash can actually serve as a mobilizing tool for racial and ethnic minority as well as for immigrant voters. And I do think there's evidence for that. So think about, again, if we go back into history and look at this, we've seen this happen in California back in the 90s, where Prop 187, if you all recall, was enacted, which prevented immigrants, primarily Latinos, from being eligible for social services, undocumented immigrants. And the backlash to that in response was that many Latinos ended up naturalizing and becoming citizens and becoming more politically engaged. We just had the 25th anniversary of the passage of Prop 187 last year. And so if you look at how the change in the Latino population and their civic and political participation has evolved since that time, I think that's kind of one sort of way that you can see why that in moments in history when this backlash happens, that it can actually mobilize communities to become more politically engaged, right? Again, think about the most recent political events. One of the main headlines that came out of the 2020 presidential elections was that turnout hit all-time historic highs, not just for the broader American population, but specifically for Black Americans and for Latinos as well. Okay, as we saw in Georgia, this the backlash that happened over the summer and with the racial unrest and the attacks against many Black Americans led to a surge in civic engagement and political participation amongst Black voters in Georgia. So that's, I think, another piece of evidence of where this sort of backlash can have a mobilizing and positive effects. But overall, right, I think it would be hard to deny that the racial divides in this country are not dissipating. And just a last note, when President Obama was elected in 2008, there were many political pundits who said, okay, well, this country has now entered this momentous period of a post-racial America. And even saying that and thinking about it, 13 years later. I mean, I never found that to be a compelling argument or headline to begin with, but to think that we are post-racial just because we elected our nation's first Black president, I think was very inaccurate, that statement that was made, but very naive to think that that historic event would also serve as a mobilizing tool and as a backlash for many Americans in this country. So I'm going to stop now, and then I would be delighted to take whatever questions that anyone in the audience has.
Thank you, Professor Abrajano. That was a fabulous presentation. So interesting. We will open it up for questions. I want to start off with a question, if I may, and that is, you speak about the perception of burden of immigrants. Don't you think that universities, government, and the media are doing a really poor job of communicating the positive economic impact of immigrants?
That's a great question, Susan. And I certainly I would say that more could be done, right? There's no doubt that a counter narrative exists, and we know it exists. But one thing, and this is something I talk about in my class to my undergraduate students about race and politics, is that the media's incentives are very different from our own, right? In the sense that the media is incentivized by profit and the kinds of articles they put out, and especially the mass news media. And so anytime you're talking about immigration, right, just think about like the latest immigration story you've heard. It has to be attention getting, it has to be something that sells. And I think stories that sell are the ones that involve a preponderance of criminality, right? Stories that have action to it. And so lots of scholars have studied this. And so if you think about what is more appealing to get audience members, the nightly audience to pay attention to the nightly news, is it about a border crossing that somebody's trying to escape? Does that gain more attention? Or an immigrant who is working hard and supporting their family and being a good citizen? I mean, this is why every single night on the nightly local news, we see something having to do with a car chase, a burglary, something having to do with that, because that is what sells in the news. And so you can take that same research and apply it easily to immigration, of what is more attractive and what picks up more viewership. And same, I would say, with political elites, to instigate fear amongst the public, which is what President Trump consistently relied on when he was talking about immigrants. That certainly gains more attention and more traction amongst the public than highlighting the hardworking immigrants or the kinds of economic benefits that they provide in the US, right? So it's also part of like the psychology of voters, is that fear is a much more compelling emotion than other more positive emotions, if you will.
I think we need to put our marketing departments on that, right? All right, we have a question from Sandra. Sandra, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I wondered in this study if you were able to disaggregate the white population. The white population, in my opinion, is not a homogeneous one. And so were you able to do that?
Yes, thank you, Sandra, for that question. We did control for education. We controlled for income in all of our analyses, and we still found this effect that that despite controlling for all these other socioeconomic indicators, that it was immigration. I'm sorry, that white Americans relative to other racial and ethnic groups have these more negative views about immigrants.
All right, other members? I see I've got several of my political science people here. Peter Gorovich, have you got a question for us?
Yeah,
Hi,
I
Pete.
do. Marissa, that was a wonderful presentation. That was really great. I had a question for you about to what extent can we, I know there was a debate that we read about in the papers in the Democratic Party. They argued a lot about some people complained that defund the police was a terrible argument. And other people argued, no, that it was important to push these things forward. And whether, I remember last summer, it was very fascinating that in the Black Lives Matter movement, it was amazing how many white people marched in solidarity with people of color and to complain about that. I wonder, is there any way that the research can analyze these? To what extent, to what extent are the different behaviors by these very communities affecting the way white populations are perceiving what's going on? Are there strategic behaviors that can be looked at by the minority communities to impact behavior of whites?
Thank you for that, Peter. So, Peter, are you asking that depending on where white voters or white Americans live and the context that they live in, can that shape their views?
No, I mean, you probably read the same things that I read, that there was a lot of argument of, members of the House yelling at each other.
Right.
Why did you talk about this, defund the police, that we lost seats because you said these things? And then other people were complaining that the Black Lives Matter argument also cost seats. And I wonder, do we have any way of knowing methodologically, is there any possible way of sorting out, did these arguments made in some parts of the country have an effect in other parts of the country? Do you see what I mean? That our arguments that are made in one place,
Mm-hmm.
defund the police, that might sound well in one district, but does it have an impact? Everything is read all the way across the country. Do we know whether these arguments like defund the police are having an impact in other places, or do we not know?
I haven't come across any research myself that answers that question, but I could imagine if you had public opinion data where that was being asked, and you can disaggregate it by region or by state or by city, you can get that answer. So I can imagine that is definitely going to be a question or a research question that somebody will tackle in the future, but it's not something that I've done or I've run across. I think also part of that conversation was also the messaging, right? That wasn't the right, that was that some prominent Democratic elites found that messaging to not be the most effective strategy, if you will. Even President Obama was a critic of that messaging strategy.
Marissa,
Do you
I think
agree
that's our major problem, is we have bad marketing, really bad marketing. All right, Peter, you had another follow-on question?
No, I was just asking, does Marissa agree with Obama that was bad marketing?
I have to say, I haven't done enough research about it to be able to kind of comfortably answer that question. I certainly see his point, but I also see the point of the reason why BLM and their other coalition partners use that phrasing as well. So
Right.
to be determined, Peter, I haven't made up.
I mean, I wanted to ask this a research question. We don't have enough research to know the answer. From a research point of view, we don't know the answer, is what you're saying. Research cannot settle this.
At least from the research that I know that's that's conducted on it.
Yeah. Okay.
We have a question from Gail Liu. Go ahead, Gail.
Hi, Gail.
Hey, hi. Thank you for that inspiring lecture that you gave just now. I wanted to ask you a question that is geared toward the states that flipped from to Democrat on the electoral vote. Did you notice what was going on with the white demographics in those states that flipped, like Georgia and the Steel Belt? Like, were there more white voters that did go from Republican and voted for a Democrat to help the flip movement?
Yes, I mean, I imagine that there were some especially undecided white voters who did
Mhm.
to that. I myself specifically haven't looked at that, but there's also this, but I know that there's a lot of research that's looking at that right now. And I think the real question is yes, how many actually, so it's a lot of different, there's some possibilities, right? So I think what we always as researchers try to do is that, okay, so how did these voters behave back in 2016? Did they
Mhm.
sit out in the election? Did they abstain? Did they vote for the Republican Party? Right? Because those are like two possible things that they could have done. Or did they vote? Yeah. And so did their behavior change in 2020 as a result of the context of the election? And I think that's
Mhm.
a really interesting story. The other piece to that is in these battleground states where the margins were really, really small in the thousands, is also looking at how Democratic support increased from non-white voters as well, because again,
Mhm.
there's this there's this confluence between people who sat out in the 2016 election and didn't vote, or the other thing too is young voters who were not eligible to vote in 2016, but then were eligible to vote in 2020. That increased turnout too could have made up for the difference as well.
You know, the one thing that is always interesting to me is the Steve Kornacki map of the counties, of the rural counties versus the urban areas, and how the urban areas shifted, played a significant role in flipping those particular states. I think another thing that will be interesting, and I'll be very quick, will be to see what the January 6th Capitol
Mhm.
invasion has done to the Republican Party, and what the outcome of this impeachment trial will be, because it just seems to me that it's the Republican Party that's on trial of their moral and ethical values regarding what is happening with their party right now. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for that, Gail. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think this year is going to be critical to see how the party organization itself, we've talked a lot about framing and messaging, what their next steps are. Because if you look at Republican sort of post-mortem from 2008 and from 2012, there were these official statements that recognized there is this huge defection, or not even defection, if you will, but that primarily the base of their support is on white Americans. And if that they don't expand their outreach, that is going to be a problem for them in the future. And I think, you know, after those statements that came out from the RNC, there were conversations of, well, what are the Republican parties going to change? Are they going to become, are they going to shift closer to the center? We obviously haven't seen that happening, but there has been conversation in the party itself that recognizing, I mean, they see all these numbers just like we do, right? Like they're not blind to this, they know. But if you think about short-term strategy, on the one hand, it's working for them. So why make the effort to have to go through this outreach when they might not be very successful at it, and just continue to focus on their core base of supporters, right? Like that's a strategic decision they can make too.
Mhm.
Should I answer, Susan, this question in the
Yes, please. Go
Christine?
ahead.
Nice to see you. So Christine, is there any difference between inland states with not much actual interaction with migrants and agriculture and border states? You know, Christine, that was one of, I've always had this question and this curiosity, and and a couple years ago, I wrote an article looking at media coverage in border states versus non-border states, and to see how that was related to public opinion. Because I don't know if this is your thought, Christine, but my thought was that, well, for people along the border, they should have more tolerant views of immigrants, perhaps because of, there's this theory of contact theory that you know, the more interactions you have with people from your out group, that can make you more accepting of them, right? But that analysis actually didn't find that to be the case at all. That public opinion on immigration, at least, not so much, that study didn't look at partisanship or vote choice. The public opinion on immigration was pretty much negative. But also the other thing is, like, immigration coverage, even if you looked at border states versus non-border states, were pretty identical across the board. So it wasn't as if, in that sense, like the coverage itself differed a lot based on where you lived. So I don't know, Christine, if that's what you were thinking, or I wasn't, or maybe you had a different thought.
Well, one of the ideas behind the question is the idea that once you have a physical contact, that you know who the migrants are,
Yeah.
that will shape your intuition and how you think politically about it, no?
Yeah, that's exactly the thought. That was exactly my thought behind that project too. You know, like all ports theory, that one of the main ways that we can reduce discrimination and bias and racial animus is through having this physical contact, because you get to know you know, immigrants, if you're not an immigrant, and have less stereotypical feelings about them once you actually have personal everyday interactions and they live in your community.
And a connected question would be about race as well, no? Because if you look at Latin America, there are many more whiter people than brown people, no?
Mhm.
And I was wondering what the difference in terms of treatment and perception of cultural identity would be, no? So is there any kind of subdividing the Latin American migrants into racial categories, and then seeing what the white people think in the United States?
So are you thinking, Christine, of Latinos who self-identify racially as white
Correct.
versus those who self-identify with another race?
Exactly.
You know, that's a really interesting question. And I think part of that, or I think that the kind of better way to, or maybe the more accurate way to get at that, is it's not so much how the immigrant themselves self-identifies, it's how society perceives them. And what I mean by that is that, yes, like you said, there are many immigrants from Latin America who have European ancestry, and therefore, if you look at them phenotypically, right, they would look European. And so there's been this growing an exciting area of research in political science that I'm trying to kind of dig deeper into understanding racial attitudes, and especially about immigration, by focusing on skin color, especially, and phenotype, because how we interact with individuals from outside of our own groups is also highly shaped by our perceptions, not just of but of their skin color plays a big role in that, right? And colorism is very much a big dynamic in Latin America and here in the United States. So of course, we know that darker skinned Latinos, for example, face much more discrimination than lighter skinned Latinos. Okay, same is true for Black Americans. And so that colorism hasn't really gotten a lot of attention much in the political sphere. It's been a lot of work in sociology and economics and even in public health to show that colorism has these disparate impacts. But there is starting to grow this research that looks at how colorism also affects people's political views and their political preferences.
Professor Abrajano, may I ask one more question, and that is sort of the looping back to my first question. So are you saying that really we need to put all the money and effort on mobilization and voter engagement, increasing that, as opposed to trying to educate white people, because we're going to be much more effective with getting more and more immigrants and minorities to register and to vote? That that's really the action area?
I think it's actually both, Susan. I think if we want to address the bigger picture of addressing the racial divide that we have in this country, it can't just be either, unfortunately, half of that effort or one of those two efforts. I think it has to be both. You know, I think this is, I believe in this important point in our history where we are talking about race openly. We're talking about systemic racism. This is something that President Biden talked about in the early days of his presidency. I can't recall a president, you know, making it part of their conversation in quite a while. And I do think that the conversation has to happen on both ends. Lots of education needs to be done, and education not just amongst white Americans, but all Americans, right? Like, we all have racial biases. We all have, just because of how we were raised in this country and the nature of the nation, the nature of how we were socialized in a very racialized environment. So definitely education is key. But yeah, I also strongly believe that it's really important as well to ensure that racial and ethnic minorities feel like they belong in the political process, that they have a sense of belonging, a sense of efficacy, and that they truly feel like they're part of the polity. I think for so long, these groups have been marginalized and systematically marginalized and prevented from being participants in the political process, that I hope that we are at this important turning point where they do feel like their presence is welcomed and that they belong as part of American politics.
Very exciting. Are you going to be able to continue your political science work even though you're provost? I know from friends who have been provosts, it's a lot of work.
Yes, one of them is here on this call right now. He is still able to do his research, so I will follow in his footsteps and do my absolute best to do so. It's a juggle, Susan, but I'm very also fortunate that I've had some ongoing research projects, so that's helped me. I'm actually working on this one project right now, which is going to be a book about misinformation, and about specifically about misinformation of socially marginalized groups that include racial and ethnic minorities and Muslim Americans, and how that shapes the public's preferences and policy opinions for these groups. So yes, I hope so. I will do my best.
All right. Can you let me know when you're expecting that book to be out? Because we would very much like to host having you back again to present that book.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'll definitely keep in touch and let you know.
All right. So we'll go ahead and thank you very, very much for your astounding presentation. And we were so pleased to have you launch our double event today. Really, really pleased. This was wonderful. Thank you so much. Everybody join me in a round of applause.